When preparing for a final mixdown of your song, you may find it necessary to add automation to change certain parameters as the song progresses, for example, volume, pan, etc. Pro Tools allows you to automate many particular parameters of your session, including volume, pan, mute on audio tracks, auxiliary input tracks, and MIDI and instrument tracks, and also volume, pan, and mute on sends, and also the volume controls on master faders, as well as all of the plugin controls. So you can automate almost everything inside of any plugin that you instantiate on a channel. If you're working with a group, the group is just a combination of tracks. So if you are working in a group, for example, I am on this drum kit right here, and you decide you want to automate certain things like the volume, if you automate the volume on one track that's contained in the group, it will also affect all of the other tracks that are contained in that group. So you can see by moving just that one, I have moved all or automated all of the volume controls for all of the tracks contained in that group. Each Pro Tools audio or auxiliary input track has a single automation playlist for each automatable control. So you can't store multiple takes of automation for a single controller in an audio track. If we look at this guitar part right here, it's the fourth playlist. If I switch playlists and go to the third or the second playlist, you'll see that the automation data here remains the same for that track. So you don't have different automation data for each playlist that you may record. MIDI and instrument tracks are different. If you record a MIDI track and then draw in some automation, and then decide you want to add a second MIDI playlist, you can do that, but each MIDI clip contains its own automation data. So with MIDI clips, the automation data is stored with the clip. With audio and auxiliary input and master fader tracks, you only have one take of automation for every available control. Also, Pro Tools offers much higher resolution for its automation than MIDI-based automation. So if you have the option of automating the MIDI track or auxiliary input track that your virtual instrument is on, or your instrument track, volume fader, for example, you would be better off to automate that volume fader because of its higher resolution than using a continuous controller, which, as you know, only has 127 specific increments. Pro Tools resolution is much higher than 127. So that's something to think about as you're automating virtual instruments. There are 5 automation modes that we're going to discuss in this chapter. 3 of them you learned about in Pro Tools 101, and those are off, read, and write. So let's review those real quick. The first is the write mode. When you're in the write mode, whenever you play Pro Tools, it's recording automation. You can see by the red line here, it's recording automation. The read mode allows you to read any automation that has been written. See, this volume fader here is moving up and down following the automation that's written. The off mode, basically it leaves your automation but doesn't follow it. So the guitar volume fader here is not moving even though there is that automation there. And that's because it's off. So the 2 new automation modes that we're going to discuss today are touch and latch. So touch mode is a writing automation mode that doesn't actually start writing automation till you touch a specific fader, knob, or adjust a parameter. So in the case of this recording here, I can start writing automation, but nothing's going to occur until I grab a knob or fader. So you can see that's moving now. If I go and choose to grab this knob right here, this fader, and then move it around, it'll actually start recording once I grab that knob, or in this case, volume fader. And as soon as I release it, it returns to its original position. so you could see what was drawn. So here is the original automation, and here's where I grabbed the fader and moved it. And when I released the fader right here, it returned back to the original automation position. Latch does the same thing, except where you leave the fader position or knob position when you are done automating is where it stays. It does not return to the original position. So let me show you that one. Okay, so moving down, moving back up. As soon as I grab the volume fader and then bring it down to 0, now it's going to stay at 0 because I'm using latch. So that's the only difference between latch and touch, is that latch leaves you in the last position of your fader, and touch returns to your original automation position. There may be instances where you want to automate certain parameters, or perhaps to suspend all of the automation that you have already written. There are ways to do that in Pro Tools. If you remember, we can get to the automation window in Pro Tools by going up to the window drop-down menu and selecting automation. Here you'll see that there is a suspend button. When you click on the suspend button, it suspends every item that's automated on every track in Pro Tools. So it completely disables the automation playback. You can also choose to write enable certain parameters. We discussed these in Pro Tools 101. Let's review them again real quick. You can write plug-in information if you have this button selected, volume, pan, and mute for each track. And they have to be selected to write automation data for those specific parameters. These over here enable you to automate send information. So send volume, send pan, and send mute data. It's important to note that these buttons enable or suspend writing of automation only, and they have nothing to do with the playback. If you want to suspend playback, you have to click this suspend button. You can view your automation data by selecting the track view selector and going to the specific automation data that you want to view. So in this case, we have volume, mute, and pan automation data that we can look at. You can also come down here to the show hide automation lanes, and you can add the automation data here. So here, volume, mute, and pan. You could also choose to click the plus button and add a new layer of automation data that you could also view. So in this way, you can view multiple lanes of automation data at one time. You can also use the option modifier key while pressing the track view selector to have all tracks display a certain type of automation data. So in this case, option and pan, and you'll see all the tracks now are displaying their pan data. Before automation has been written for a control, the automation playlist shows a single breakpoint at the beginning of the track and a straight line indicating the initial position of that automation control. You can see that right here. After automation's been created, the automation graph shows each automation breakpoint that's been created. So we could go in here with the pencil tool and draw it, and you can see it's added all these individual breakpoints. The graphical representation of your automation will appear slightly differently depending on the type of automation or the type of parameter that you're automating. So for example, volume automation is going to go from 0 dB, you can look up here on the left, 0 dB all the way up to possibly plus 12 dB, and 0 dB being somewhere around in here. If you're looking at mute automation data, it's either going to be on or off. So now this track is muted, and you can see that the track is muted. So that type of automation data is either on or it's off. There's no variables in between here. And the third type, panning, is either going to be pan center or 0, which is the knob straight up or straight forward, like this, or left or right by 100 on either side.